So I'm going to slowly say hello while people log in. Everyone's sort of filing into the virtual room here. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Parent. I am the co-owner, along with my husband, Stephen Sparks, of Point Reyes Books and our second bookstore in Fairfax, California, called Wayfinder Bookshop. And we're so excited to have Heather Swan and Jane Hirshfield here today for a reading and conversation in celebration of the release of Heather Swan's Where the Grass Still Sings, Stories of Insects and Interconnection. Before you all joined us, we've all been having just a great time talking about whether honeybees are more like Zen or Tibetan monks in their sense of humor. So that tells me that this conversation is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. It's presented as part of our series titled Thinking Like a Mountain, which is a quarterly subscription and event series about ecosystems, resilience, and climate. And through this series, we strive to share work that takes many forms, and Where the Grass Still Sings is an exemplary example of what we mean when we talk about all these things. So thank you so much to Heather and Jane for being here. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of them and then turn it over to them for a conversation. You can learn more about our upcoming events and also about the Thinking Like a Mountain series at our website, ptreysbooks.com. I will also put some links in the chat as we go along so that you can follow what we're up to at Point Reyes Books. You can also use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask a question at any time. I will be gathering those questions and coming back on in the last 15 or 10 minutes of the event to raise some of those questions for Heather and Jane. So I'll give some reminders about that in the chat as well, to ask a question whenever you feel so moved, and we'll hold the last 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions. So now I'll introduce our speakers for today. Heather Swan is a poet and creative nonfiction writer. Her critically acclaimed book, Where Honeybees Thrive, Stories from the Field, also published by Penn State University Press, won the Sigward F. Olson Nature Writing Award and first prize in the scholarly book category at the annual New York Book Show. She teaches writing and environmental literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And again, she's here today in celebration of Where the Grass Still Sings, Stories of Insects and Interconnection, also published by Penn State University Press. She's joined in conversation today by Jane Hirshfield. Jane is the author of 10 collections of poetry and 2 now classic collections of essays on poetry's deep workings, and the editor of 4 co-translated books presenting world poets from the deep past. Hirshfield is one of American poetry's central spokespersons for concerns about the biosphere and interconnection. Her honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations and from the Academy of American Poets, the Poetry Center Book Award, and the California Book Award. And quite importantly, we consider her to be a dear friend of Point Reyes Books. So thank you, Jane, for being here today. So now I'll turn it over to these two and the insects, and I will see you at the end for audience questions.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that. And thank you, Point Reyes Books. And thank you, everyone who's tuning in today. It's a strange day in the world, and it's a great day, I think, to think about poetry and prose and the natural world. Thank you so much, Jane, for being here with me today. And so I think that we'll start just by saying that this is not a typical reading. Jane and I have sort of created a dialogue between our work, and I think that I hope that you'll enjoy what we've created for you today. Before I begin, I think I'd just like to say why I was so excited about having Jane Hirshfield with me today. Jane and I have a deep connection that goes back a long way, and many of our connections have to do with our interests. We have a deep interest in the natural world. We are both interested in small creatures like crickets and poison dart frogs and boll weevils and bumblebees and lichens and rats. And rats is especially Jane's territory. But I think that the other thing that I just want to share, I guess, and we're also really interested in the problems with the state of the planet and are informed by Buddhist traditions. But I really want to share that my initial connection with Jane came because when I was a young woman, opened up one of Jane's books. And it was at a time when I was really, really not doing very well. And I opened strangely to a single poem called Salt Heart, and it saved my life. And I say that without any kind of exaggeration. It really did save my life, and it continues to save my life. And there were some lines in that poem that I'll share with you that were particularly important. But before that, I'm just going to ask Jane if she will please read Salt Heart for us.
Heather. Thank you so much. I will just let people know that it comes up later in the poem, but the poem was written just after I came home from what I knew would be my final visit with a friend. Salt Heart. I was tired, half sleeping in the sun. A single bee delved the lavender nearby, and beyond the fence, a trowel's shoulder knocked a white stone. Soon the ringing stopped, and from somewhere a quiet voice said the one word, surely a command, though it seemed more a question, a wondering perhaps, what about joy? So long it had been forgotten, even the thought raised surprise. But however briefly there in the untuned devotions of bee and the lavender fragrance, the murmur of better and worse was unimportant. From next door the sound of raking, and neither courage nor cowardice mattered. Failure, uncountable failure, did not matter. Soon enough that gate swung closed, the world turned back to heart salt of wanting, heart salts of will and grief. My friend would continue dying, at last only exhausted, even his wrists thinned with pain. The river suffering would take what it wished of him, then go. And I would stay and drink on, as the living do, until the rest would enter into that water, the lavender swept in, the bee, the swallowed labors of my neighbor, the ordinary moment swept in, whatever it drowsily holds. I begin to believe the only sin is distance, refusal, all others stemming from this. Then come, rivers come, irrevocable futures, come, come even joy, even now, even here, and though it vanish like him.
Thank you for reading that beautiful, beautiful poem, Jane. So I thought I would not get through this without crying a little bit, so I'm going to just say I'm sorry in advance. The thing about this poem that saved my life was that I had been in a place where I had been avoiding fear and pain with so much energy that I had also numbed myself to every experience. And it was this line, I begin to believe the only sin is distance, refusal, all others stemming from this, that saved me, and has actually been such an important thing as I navigate this contemporary moment as well. And I read it, actually, this poem, to all of my students, in part because I think that one of the really important messages of that line is that with distance, we can begin to disregard. We can begin to take advantage or eliminate many, many things. And so the idea of that distance being the first sin. But the second part of that for me was that what I was refusing was, as this poem is offering, I was refusing to actually let myself into a space of mourning and grief. And by holding it at bay, I was also holding joy at bay. And this correction and this invitation, I needed so desperately to go on. And once I was able to move through that pain and enter the experience of life again, I started to return to wonder. And so this book that I've created is so much, it's so born out of this poem, Jane. I just have to say that it's just such an honor And actually that line is the epigraph to my first collection of poetry. It's been an important line, so I just have to say thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Jane, for writing that poem and for being my mentor and my wise friend for so many years and for sharing this space with me today. So just wanted to say that.
You know what an extraordinary honor and just astonishing moment it is to find that, a line I needed to write to save myself, a poem I needed to find to save myself, did that for someone who I have come to care so much about. And, I feel such an equal and astonishing gratitude for Where the Grass Still Sings. It is a gorgeous book, physically. I wish you all could see the interior and all of it. It's a gorgeous book, and it's a fascinating book, and it is a necessary book. So could you tell us a little more directly about it?
I will. Thank you so much. So the book Where the Grass Still Sings, Stories of Insects and Interconnection, braids science and art and poetry and stories about people who are working to save ecosystems. In particular, it thinks about insects, but it's actually thinking about all of these creatures that are dependent upon this incredible web of being. And I think that in this historical moment, there's so much that we can feel sad about, which we can discuss. But I also really wanted this book to be about reminding people to have that curiosity, to move past this sense of trying to deaden ourselves to all of the news, and to remember delight, and to remember that sense of wonder that we have as a child, because I feel like in some ways it helps us navigate these times. When I open the book, I'm really talking about when I was a child. I had this experience where I lived in a barn with my mother and my sister, and it was pretty rudimentary, and there were a lot of creatures living in that space with us. And my mother had this great idea. I just commend her for this so strongly. But her idea was that to keep us from being afraid, she decided to name everything that was living in the building with us, and that included bats and spiders and wasps and all kinds of things. But my mother's creature naming strategy was really part of this recognition that the names that we have for things actually can really dictate the way that we have or do not have respect for them. So I'll read just a little bit from this introduction. So my mother's creature naming strategy helps solidify my belief that all of the non-humans around us have amazing, complicated lives worthy of respect and honor. The foundation of this idea started even earlier for me, when my parents were still together and we were living next to a prairie where I spent my days with my dog, inventing stories about all of the insects and toads and birds that lived there. The fact that all of these beings did not share language with me did not strike me as something indicative of their inferiority. If anything, I thought humans were the ones with limitations. To this day, it feels like a gift to be in the presence of wild things. One of the most powerful aspects of this kind of experience for me was the sound. I remember so clearly the sounds of frogs singing on spring evenings, and how that ringing in the air helped me sleep, how the crickets thrumming soothed me, how the cicadas' relentless vibrations seemed to clearly articulate the intensity of the heat and humidity of summer afternoons. Wrens, robins, mourning doves, and cardinals created an inviting chorus early each morning, and those sounds allowed me to define spaces, singing meadows, creeks, hollows. Years later, when I began keeping honeybees, the sound of the hive gave me an immense sense of peace, as they do to this day. A landscape in this part of the United States being devoid of sound is terrifying to me, as it is for all landscapes around the world. And more, as Rachel Carson so clearly imagined and illustrated in her opus about DDT, silent springs are now becoming a reality. Wild things are disappearing all over the world. And I'm just going to jump to the end of this, the first chapter, because after every chapter, I have a gallery, and in the galleries, I have artists featured. And so I'm just in this initial gallery, I feature the work of Rosalind Monks, who does these just really astonishing ink drawings of of insects, and they're incredibly intricate. And oh yes, there we are. Thank you, Jane. Show and tell. But what I think about in this this section is really thinking about looking carefully at all of the intricacies that we miss, because a lot of the world is just smaller than we are. And when we begin to really look, there's so much incredible wonder. And I talk in the chapter about, in the gallery, about cicadas, but I also talk about many other things, including this. There are bees in Turkey who build their fragile nests out of flower petals, creating the most delicate and beautiful pastel cups for their babies. Honeybees dance maps in the dark for the other bees in their communities to find fragrant flowers that need pollinating. Fireflies light up. Thank you, Jane. Monk's artwork invites us to look more closely at the world, to pay attention, to investigate even the smallest creatures we encounter during our one wild and precious life. And what I wanted to do at this point is just ask you, Jane, if you would jump in and say a bit about your own experience of distance and wonder.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So, the thing that I think happens to all of us is it takes a moment to realize when you've lost your sense of wonder. You're so down in the abyss and the dark that you don't even see where you are. It's the nature of the experience. And so I'm going to read to start one really short poem. I love really short poems, and this is one of the new ones. I suppose I should hold up my own book, The Asking New and Selected Poems, which Point Reyes Books has had me do an earlier event on as well. So I overheard myself. Somebody asked me a question and I answered it. And then I heard myself. And this tiny pebble poem came out of that. Its title is My Failure. I said of the view, just some trees. And what a betrayal. Sure, it wasn't a charismatic megafauna view of, an amazing mountain or a water view, but those trees, and later in my stay in that place, I wasn't home. And later in my stay in that place, I reached a moment where I found myself walking through those just some trees, scrub woods. And every tree that I came across, I heard myself internally saying, sister, sister, sister. So I will read one other poem, the opposite side of this. This is an earlier poem, a local tree. It's actually right, not many feet at all to my side here. So I live in Mill Valley, and Mill Valley is full of second growth redwoods because the original Mount Tam redwoods were all cut down and to rebuild San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and fire. But it's been, a century and more, and all those trees have come back. And so this one, one of those trees, you cut a redwood and a circle of young trees come up from around it, around that original mother tree. This tree someday and this house, as the tree keeps getting bigger, are going to have a problem. And I started to think about that. And I realized, the tree deserves first place. If anything goes, it should be me and the house and not the tree. So the poem is simply called Tree. It is foolish to let a young redwood grow next to a house. Even in this one lifetime, you will have to choose. That great calm being, this clutter of soup pots and books. Already the first branch tips brush at the window. Softly, calmly, immensity taps at your life.
Such a good poem. Oh, Jane. Yes, thank you. I feel like that is, it's such an important thing to think about, that we do have this as humans. We will have complicity. We will have the moment when we recognize that it's part of being human to consume something, to live next to a tree that will tap at your window. And I love that. I love thinking about how to sort of hold that tension with this desire to make change, to try to do that more gently, because I feel like in some ways, if we don't acknowledge that that tension is there,
Yeah.
it's easier to ignore it. And I feel like one of the things that some of us have been kind of ignoring maybe is all the change that's happening to the planet. And I read a lot about change in this book, good change and bad change. And what's interesting is that in Metamorphosis, it has been so often used in writing, and often the symbol of that is a butterfly, because of course this is remarkable thing that happens with a butterfly, and this transformation between the caterpillar and the winged creature has been just an amazing symbol for growth and change. And actually, there's a poem in that section by James Cruz about the difficulty of that transformation that happens. But I think that that I'd love to have you actually read another poem kind of about change that can happen. That isn't necessarily the good change. That's actually part of the natural world also. So maybe would you, when I read this poem, it was one of those poems, Jane, where I read it and I was just like, I did start to weep actually. So I'll hold it together. But if you could read Today Another Universe, that would be amazing.
So this is another, everything we need to know is within the circle of our own eyesight and lives. We don't need to go elsewhere to see the evidence of climate change and catastrophe. It's right here with us. So this is a different local tree. This one is on the other, or was on the other side, and not my little plot of land and neighbors, but everyone who lived around it, we all loved that tree. So here, Today, Another Universe. The arborist has determined senescence, beetles, canker, quickened by drought, but in any case, not prunable, not treatable, not to be propped. And so, the branch from which the sharp-shinned hawks and their mate cries, the trunk where the ant, the red squirrel's 80-foot playground, the bark, cambium, pine sap, cluster of needles, the Japanese patterns, the ink net, the dapple on certain fish. Today, for some, a universe will vanish, first noisily, then just another silence, the silence of after, once the theater has emptied, of bewilderment after the glacier, the species, the star. Something else in the scale of quickening things will replace it. This whole of light in the light, the puzzled birds swerving around it.
The puzzled birds swerving around it. I feel like one of the things that your poetry does is it honors the absences in that poem in a way that I think is really, really important right now, because I think that, and we've talked about this a lot, that there's so much science that is telling us these things, but it is not until we can sort of articulate that in a way that is unique and fresh, as you've done in a poem, that we can actually mourn it and move through that. And I feel like we should talk in a moment maybe about your decision to do the Poets for Science, but maybe I'll say a little bit about some of those numbers that sort of inspired me to work through this book in a different way. Because I certainly feel like one of the things as a teacher is that I want my students to be aware of things. You know, I want them to know the facts. And often they don't know them. And I remember that a fact that I learned back in 2017 was that there was an entomologist named Casper Hallman and his colleagues, and he published this paper that revealed the evidence that 75% of the flying insects had disappeared in 25 years. And I thought to myself, okay, that's horrifying, but that can't be true all over the place. You know, that can't be what's happening everywhere. But in fact, unfortunately, I went and there were more studies and more studies, global studies that were being done. And the thing is that, so what it made me want to understand the story of insects over time. So I went and I spent some time with Peter Oboisky at the Essig Museum at Berkeley to look at insect collections and think about how important insects are to ecosystems, and also what he was learning, you know, by looking at these collections about how insects had, you know, changed their populations. And he showed me incredible drawers filled with, you know, remarkable leaf insects and stick insects and dragonflies and all kinds of beetles. And but what he told me about, so what I was seeing was just this amazing array of insects. But he started telling me a story about how he had been called to Hawaii to help on this study that was about a golden-headed honey creeper called the palila. And I was sort of confused by this. I thought, well, oh, but I thought you were an insect person. And he said, well, yes. And he told me this story that these birds, which were absolutely incredible and important in Hawaii, were disappearing because the cydia moths were a necessary part of their diet, and they were disappearing. And so he was showing me that the smallest shift in an ecosystem can completely change it. The birds circling, you know, the puzzle birds. But what I said to him was, ecosystems must be so fragile then, right? And he said to me, no, actually, you know, they're not. And so now I'll read a little bit from the book, because this was a little bit surprising to me. But then I'll just read. He said, he was quick to point out to me that fragile might not be the best word. In fact, ecosystems constantly fluctuate and are quite dynamic. They can recover from subtle changes. But collapse does happen when there are too many. Oboisky used one of the Paul Ehrlich's analogies, which likened a working, healthy ecosystem to an airplane. In Ehrlich's analogy, the species in an ecosystem represents rivets on the plane. And if you know one rivet is missing from an airplane wing, you'll probably still get on the flight. But if you know that there are a lot of rivets missing, you know that the plane is much more likely to fail. Oboisky noted that landscape changes destroy more and more insect habitats, and urbanization eats up many landscapes. These changes certainly will be devastating to ecosystems. And I thought about bulldozers and chainsaws, the felling of trees, the endlessly expanding pavement, mountaintop removal mining, the destruction of marshes and fens, housing developments warming the world, the rampant pesticide use. And I thought, where are these creatures going to go? You know, which ones are left? How can we help them? And I think that my experience there sort of made me feel, on the one hand, overwhelmed, but it really also inspired me to find the people that were working on fixing these problems in small ways, so that we could have ecosystems that were, you know, healthier, that we were helping them instead of hindering them. And so I spent time, I went a lot of places for this book, but one of the interesting experiences for me was going to biodiversity hotspots in Colombia and Ecuador and meeting people who are on the ground, just individuals doing this amazing work. And so some of those stories are in the book. And they were, you know, as I was going along, I learned that there were so many individual species that were endangered, and just really feeling like I wanted to honor them. And I know, Jane, you've thought about this as well, with your poem, As If Moving Heavy Furniture. So maybe you could read that poem.
Oh, I love, the respect for the scientists who are tracking what is happening that would be invisible because it happens very slowly, and doing the work always, locally with close examination of detail. So one of my closer friends is a food web biologist whose research site is a patch of UC Berkeley Reserve land up on the Eel River. And she and her geomorphologist husband have been tracking this piece of land and its changes intimately for decades. So, counting, the simple act, all the people who go to the volunteer bird counts, all the people, observation is the beginning of change, of understanding, and also of change. So this relatively short poem, as if hearing the heavy furniture moved on the floor above us. As things grow rarer, they enter the ranges of counting. Remain this many Siberian tigers, that many African elephants, 300 red-legged egrets. We scrape from the world its tilt and meander of wonder, as if eating the last burned onions and carrots from a cast iron pan. Closing eyes to taste better the char of ordinary sweetness.
Yeah, that's such an amazing piece as well. Just the savoring and that recognition. I feel like in your book, Ledger, you really took on the environmental and many societal issues. And in an interview I read that you were talking about this book, and you said that more and more you were thinking about writing about the future. And I feel like one of the things that I think about a lot is, how do you balance this? How do you balance telling the truth about what's going on with this, with wonder, or how do you navigate the immense sadness? But I feel like, again, and I'm sort of repeating myself, I feel like one of the things that we can use is poetry. And I guess maybe I'd have you read one more poem if you would, or two if you'd like, from Ledger, but thinking about Let Them Not Say, because I think in some ways this is an invitation for us to do that noticing that you're talking about, to say, let's be real about what's happening. And yet you don't condemn us completely, which is, I think, a really amazing move in the poem. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So this was a poem, I'd been writing about the environment and its changes and the natural world as its resource and as our witness and as our companion for decades. But I wrote this poem in 2014 when somehow, I have a poem called Global Warming from 2004. But somehow in 2014, the urgency of it all stepped forward another notch for me, the way it has been these last few years for people in California, New York, throughout the effect of all those places that have had the red days because of fire smoke, when you wake up and the world is visibly not what it was. And when we had that day in the Bay Area in 2020, it felt to me as if a scrim had been pulled back, and I was actually seeing the damage as it is, which is mostly hidden from us. So anyhow, in 2014, the urgency stepped forward, and I wrote this poem thinking of how the future will look back on us and know, how did we do? And the poem is hoping to undo itself. It is hoping that in 150 years old, it will be proven wrong and foolish and silly. And if somebody were ever to stumble over it, they would say, why was she so worried? So it's a kind of spell poem in that way, and that it's
Yes, good. Yes,
trying to
let's
do
hope that.
something.
Let's hope that.
Yeah. And thank you for noticing, that it does have compassion for us as we are, because that is also very important to me.
Mm.
Both the admission that, I'm part of it, where I'm using electricity, I go places in my car, but also, we human beings, we are doing what our species evolved to do, and some of that involves taking resources.
Mm-hmm.
So the great balancing act of the terror of what may come, and that one cannot lose the radiance, one cannot lose the love of warmth. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say, we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned.
Oh,
So the poem ends with a great grief, but also, I'm very grateful that I have been able to sit by warmth and read a book when it is dark out. I cannot totally turn my back on that.
I think that that's such, I love that you did that in the poem, because I think that one of the things that comes up again in conversations that I have with students is this sort of idea that if we just eliminated the human, everything would be great, and so there's this kind of, it's actually a terrifying sort of idea for them to be thinking about. And I always want to remind them that there are so many creative people. There are so many wonderful things that we've created. And we're smart enough to figure out how to have a different balance. We can do it. And we are, it's funny because I think about how what we do is reflect back that incredible beauty that exists. And so part of the human possibility involves noticing all of this miraculous life that's going on around us. And if we could do it a little bit more gently, that would be fabulous. But I agree. I do love to sit and read with a lamp.
Yeah.
So,
And another part of what you've just been saying is the very simple fact that we will only work to save what we love.
yes. Yeah. That's so true.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that I discovered as I was working through this book was that it was love that was motivating so many of these people that I met who were doing just astonishing things. I met farmers who were practicing agroforestry in Ecuador and who are, very dependent on little tiny midges that pollinate their chocolate plants. And I spent time with Jeremy Hemberger, he's an entomologist that's in love with bumblebees. Mike Ulashen is a biologist, an entomologist actually in who thinks about forest ecology, and he spends all kinds of time finding little beetles in bark and showing me how that it's so important for keeping that forest healthy. And there's a woman who she and her family were really worried about the native orchids in Colombia, and they just kind of did this crazy thing where they just got this land that was complete. It was the side of a mountain. It was completely denuded, nothing there, but sort of like they could pick it up and it was just sand coming through their hands. They have completely restored that landscape. And what they were doing was they were planting all kinds of native plants so that they could invite the right insects in, so that they could have this wide array of just extraordinary orchids. And they are doing that out of love. No one is paying them to do that. They're just doing it because they're in love with that landscape. And that gives me so much hope. And there's so many more stories like that. And I hope that in the book, what I'm doing is showing that all of these things are important, that the poems that I've included, and the art that I've included, and the science that I've included, and all of these individuals, that it takes that whole community, that mosaic of effort to really make change. And as I was thinking about that, I realized, like, oh yeah, it's because, we think that we're so isolated as individuals, but we're so deeply, deeply interconnected with each other, with the land, with the insects. And it was something that I really intuited as a child, and I write a little bit about that. And of course, studying Buddhism later, it became more of a philosophical understanding. And ecosystems, of course, work as interconnected systems. And I know that you've thought about this as well. So I wondered if you could read an interconnection poem for us.
Yeah.
Also, I think a love poem.
Yeah. So the one that occurred to me, it began as a poem about love. And there's one line in it where, that's really clear. It says two people. But over the decades, this is probably the earliest poem that's in this book that I still read regularly, that still comes back to me, that I have a relationship to. It goes all the way back to 1982. The thing that one starts to find out about poems over time is they can change their meaning. You write them. So for example, Let Them Not Say. I wrote that completely with the eco-crisis of the biosphere in mind. It was first published on the day of the 2017, we all know who that was, presidential inauguration. So it went viral as a political poem, and then came back to being an environmental poem. And when I was reading from this new book, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, oh, I thought it was about a different crisis entirely. And I just sort of looked at her and said, well, maybe it's an all-purpose crisis poem. So this is an all-purpose poem about connection and interconnection and the abidingness of that. It was once used as a broadside to be given out as a diplomatic poem to powerful people in the Middle East. You just never know.
Yeah.
What binds us? There are names for what binds us. Strong forces, weak forces. Look around, you can see them. The skin that forms in a half-empty cup, nails rusting into the places they join, joints dovetailed on their own weight. The way things stay so solidly wherever they've been set down, and gravity, scientists say, is weak. And see how the flesh grows back across a wound with a great vehemence, more strong than the simple, untested surface before. There's a name for it on horses when it comes back darker and raised. Proud flesh. As all flesh is proud of its wounds, wears them as honors given out after battle, small triumphs pinned to the chest. And when two people have loved each other, see how it is like a scar between their bodies, stronger, darker, and proud. How the black cord makes of them a single fabric that nothing can mend or tear.
So much important stuff in that poem, Jane. Oh, so beautiful. I love the idea that the wound is a place that allows us to get stronger, right? The stronger flesh, and that it's our woundedness that can actually create a strength and resilience for the future. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that poem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Molly.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt, it feels like, but I also am mindful that we're nearing the end, and I've got some questions to share, and wanted to remind everyone that now would be the time to put any questions in the Q&A box or in the chat if you're having trouble with that, and we'll make sure to get to them. So We have a question from Nicole, and it's a doozy and it's a three-parter. So I'm going to read the whole text and then I'm happy to break it down into follow-up questions if that's helpful. The idea of distance as sin as mentioned in Jane's poem is profound on many levels. This is a question for both Heather and Jane. When you grow weary, when you most want to turn away, are there practices you have that help you hold fast to being there? Are there quotidian practical moves that serve as a remedy to stitch us to the here and now? And what importance might this take during this time of climate crisis with so much trauma in the world today?
Heather?
I think the thing I immediately went to is that the place that I go to always is I go outside and I start just paying attention to the things that are happening in my very most local world. And it, I think about when my father died during the pandemic, there was so much grief. There was universal grief happening. There was just, the grief of certainly the virus. And then there was just, unbelievable societal grief happening. And then my father died. And when he died, I remember thinking that I was grieving not only for him, but I could feel that just this sort of the human feeling of loss. And it was interesting because I remember, and this is actually, I talk about this in the book, but I remember going out by myself, out onto the water in my kayak, and it was at the end of the day, and I felt sort of bleak going out there. And I ended up getting towards this island, and when I got there, there were these 3 cranes that were standing in the end of day light, and they allowed me to come up right next to them on the shore, and I could hear them sort of making their little sounds, and I could hear all of the sounds of the lake and all of the crickets and all of the whispers of the grasses around me. And I suddenly just felt so strongly that we are just being held at all times by this incredible energy of the earth, and that there is loss, but there's also rebirth, and that there are these cycles that are just so comforting in some ways. And so for me, that has been something that is so important, is just to start paying attention to whatever's around me. Jane, how about you?
So I could tell a very similar story about my mother dying in 2020. But your story kind of covers that part of it. So I will just give one practical practice that I have taken up, which I find helpful. Some years ago, pre-pandemic, I went to Australia to do a writers' festival for the first time. And there's an expression in Australia, which is just a general exclamation of happiness, which is the person will just say, "You beauty," you beauty. And it just means, it's just an expression of happiness. But I loved it. And I have taken to, wherever I am, and if I'm home, this will be addressed to Mount Tam, but wherever I am, when I first open my eyes upon waking, whatever I see, I greet it with "You beauty." And that is a way to begin every day, no matter what the circumstances, with gratitude for the beauty of the world, and also for being alive and able to witness it. We won't be alive all that long. First it's our parents, then it's us, then it's our children, it's one eye blink of existence. And, what a joy to be able to open your eyes and see, in whatever you see, the beauty of it, the happiness of existence. It's a wonderful question. Thank you for
thank you,
asking
Nicole.
it. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. And I was happy to be able to raise it. And so we're receiving a lot of just gratitude for this conversation, what a gift it's been, and how thoughtfully you two have put it together for all of us to be with on this beautiful summer afternoon. And there is a question about whether we could ask Heather to read one of her poems. And Heather, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if you two had actually talked about any further readings, or if there was anything else that you want to kind of close out in dialogue with each other, as you've done so well. And just passing along the, the audience request for some more of your work, Heather.
I'm happy to do that. Maybe I'll read from Dandelion, which is my my recent book. And I think that I'll read a poem that really invites you to go out and connect with the natural world. And it's called Invitation. At the forest's cusp, a sacred pull from leaf mold, xylem, phloem. Blood of the sparrow, blood of the shrew, all of us of a kind. There is an invitation beyond the noise of industry and ego, a veil you and I can step through.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. Oh my goodness. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
It really is. This is we've just had two wonderful sort of ending notes, and now, of course, some more questions are coming in. The last one that I will just surface in these last couple of minutes, just to sort of end on a maybe quick and fun note, more on the note of bees and their senses of humor, is simply the question, your favorite insect and why?
Oh,
and that can be our closing note.
Jane?
I'm going to go with a really obvious one. I'm going to go with fireflies. That's the story I didn't tell about my mother. Was
yes, the fireflies.
A firefly story, and I will just leave it at that. I adore fireflies, and we don't have any where I live. They don't come west of the Mississippi, and so whenever I find myself around them, especially since the experience that I had with them after my mother's death in 2020, every night, if I know there are fireflies, I will not go to bed without going out to visit them.
I love that story so much, and they are the most magical, I think, of insects, perhaps. Though they're all extraordinary. And asking me is like asking someone, which is your favorite child? So it's really difficult. I will say that probably the insects that I spend the most time with are bees, and they're the bumblebees are especially wonderful because they are just like little stuffed bears flying around and loving the flowers and falling in and getting sort of drunk on the nectar. And I have to say that I do spend a lot of time just gazing at them and thinking like, yay, I'm so glad you're here. So maybe I'll end with that.
So we did pick a closing poem. Do you want us to close now?
That's perfect.
So we picked two, but one of them is new since the book, and I forgot to bring it to this table. So we'll do one which is in the book. This is a poem called Optimism. More and more. So resilience is a technical term in biology about resilient ecosystems. So optimism. More and more, I have come to admire resilience, not the simple resistance of a pillow whose foam returns over and over to the same shape, but the sinuous tenacity of a tree. Finding the light newly blocked on one side, it turns in another. A blind intelligence, true, but out of such persistence arose turtles, rivers, mitochondria, figs, all this resinous, unretractable earth.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you.